Before I begin the third speech, I will list the three arguments we anticipated from each side. From proposition, we expected three claims. First, that voting is powerful, so voters should understand basic political facts before participating. Second, that a political knowledge test would reduce manipulation, misinformation, and emotional voting. Third, that a more informed electorate would produce better policy and stronger democracy. From opposition, we expected three responses. First, that voting is not a privilege earned by passing a quiz. It is the basic right that makes someone a political equal. Second, that political knowledge tests are never neutral in practice because the state controls the content, language, access, and scoring. Third, that the way to fix voter ignorance is civic education, better media, and accessible political information, not taking people's vote away. Now I'll move into the round. Judges, the central mistake proposition makes is that they treat democracy like a classroom. They imagine the state as a teacher, citizens as students, and the ballot as a reward you receive after proving you studied enough. But democracy is not a classroom. Democracy is the system that allows people to control the government that controls them. That distinction decides the debate. I'll collapse the round into three questions. First, what is the purpose of voting? Second, can this test ever be fair? And third, which side actually creates a better informed democracy? Starting with the first question, what is the purpose of voting? Proposition says voting should be limited to people who know enough about politics. That sounds reasonable until you ask what voting is actually for. Voting is not just a way to select correct policy. It is how ordinary people defend their interests against power. You do not need to understand every part of monetary policy to be harmed by inflation. You do not need to know the exact committee structure or parliament to care whether your school is underfunded. And you do not need to pass a foreign policy test to have your family affected by war. The people proposition excludes are still governed. They still pay taxes and they still obey laws. So the question is simple. If the government has power over you, why should you not have power over the government? That is the first major weighing point. Proposition's best impact is that maybe some voters become more informed. Our impact is that real citizens lose the most basic tool they have to protect themselves. And that harm is not theoretical. It falls on the exact people whose voices democracy needs to hear. Poor citizens, elderly citizens, disabled citizens, and minorities. These are not people with less stake in politics. Often, they have the most stake. Proposition says if people do not understand politics, they should not vote. However, if people do not understand politics, the state has failed to educate them, and it should not be punished by stripping them of power. Second, can the test ever be fair? Proposition will probably say the test is simple, with basic questions, neutral facts, and no ideology. But the problem is not just what the first version of the test looks like. The problem is who controls it. Who writes the questions? Who chooses the language? How often does the test change? What score is passing? Are there testing centers in rural areas? Are there accommodations for disability? Every single one of those choices can advantage some citizens and burden others. And once the state has the power to decide who is knowledgeable enough to vote, that power will be used politically. Maybe not openly, maybe not with the villain announcing on television, but quietly, through administrative rule, confusing wording, inaccessible locations, narrow deadlines, and questions that reflect the worldview of the people already in power. That is why historical literacy tests matter in this debate. They were defended as neutral. They were described as tests of competence, but in practice, they became tools to exclude black voters and preserve existing power. Proposition may say that their world would be different, but that misses the lesson. The lesson is not only that past governments were racist. The deeper lesson is that when the state is allowed to put a test between the citizen and the ballot, the test becomes a weapon for whoever controls the state. Democracy should not require citizens to trust the government before they are allowed to hold that government accountable. The third and final question is which side creates a better informed democracy? This is where the proposition's case is the weakest. They assume that a test creates knowledge, but often a test creates memorization, resentment, and exclusion. A person can memorize the names of government branches and still vote cruelly or irrationally. Another person may not know the formal terminology, but may still understand perfectly well that their rent is rising, their community is unsafe, their hospital is closing, or that their wages are too low. Political judgment is not the same as political trivia, and the opposition is not defending ignorance. That is a straw man. We believe citizens should be educated, but we support stronger civic classes, public voter guides, nonpartisan explainers, candidate debates, media literacy education, accessible ballot information, and election day outreach. The difference is that all of our solutions add knowledge without subtracting rights. Proposition subtracts rights first and hopes knowledge follows later, and that creates terrible incentives. In their world, politicians no longer need to persuade people who fail the test. Parties do not need to mobilize them. Schools and governments can blame citizens for not passing instead of fixing civic education. The politically excluded become easier to ignore because they no longer affect elections. But in our world, every citizen counts. That forces politicians to speak beyond elites. It forces parties to engage people where they are. It forces society to treat civic education as a shared public duty, not an individual obstacle course. Now let's weigh the debate clearly. On reversibility, if someone casts a bad vote, democracy has future elections, public debate, journalism, and civic movements to correct abuse. But if someone is denied the vote, they are silenced before the democratic process begins. Uncertainty. Proposition's benefit is uncertain. Maybe the test improves voter quality. Maybe it only measures memorization. Maybe it excludes good citizens. But our harm is certain. Some citizens will lose power. On principle, democracy cannot be built on the idea that the government decides which citizens are worthy of controlling it. That flips accountability upside down. And on incentives. Proposition gives the state an excuse to abandon hard civic education and replace it with a gate. Opposition forces the state to educate everyone because everyone matters. So judges, this round is not about whether political knowledge matters. It obviously does. This round is about whether ignorance should be cured by empowerment or punished by exclusion. The proposition world says that you should prove yourself first and then you should vote. However, our world says that your voice is the reason the government owes you education in the first place. The ballot is not a certificate, it is not a trophy, it is not the prize at the end of the civics exam. And for that reason, the opposition wins.